I have seen a lot in my 38 years on this bench. I have watched the wealthy walk in like the room was built for them. I have watched the connected use their family's name the way other people use a key, not to open something earned, but to bypass something owed. I have watched men sit in front of me with the specific expression of someone who has already decided how this ends, who has already calculated that the right last name, the right attorney, and the right number of people who owe their career to their father will do what it has always done: make the problem disappear. But what walked into my courtroom on the morning of October 3rd at exactly 9:05 a.m. was a particular kind of certainty I had not seen in quite that form before. A 27-year-old man who shoved a 67-year-old partially blind veteran to the ground on a public street, walked away without looking back, and then stood before me with his arms crossed and a look on his face that told me he was not here to answer for anything. He was here to wait for it to be over. And sitting 2 rows behind him, in a gray suit with no tie, was his father, the mayor of this city, a man who had held that office for 14 years, a man whose name was on buildings, a man who had never once been in a room where his presence did not change something. What that father did when his moment came made the entire courtroom go still in a way I will not forget for as long as I sit on this bench. If you think you know how this ends, stay with me, because the moment that matters in this story is not the sentence, it is not the footage. It is something that happened quietly from a man who had every reason to stay seated and chose not to. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit the bell notification, because we bring you stories like this every single week. Drop a comment before we go any further and tell me, have you ever watched someone use a powerful name to walk away from something they should have faced? Tell me what happened. Tell me if it worked, because what you are about to see is the answer to that question, and it is not the answer Brandon Mercer expected. Now, let us begin. His name was Brandon Mercer, 27 years old, the only son of Mayor Richard Mercer, who had held office in this city for 14 consecutive years. 14 years is long enough to become part of a place. Brandon had grown up inside that gravity. He had grown up watching doors open before his father raised a hand. He had grown up learning the way children learn the things their environment teaches without anyone saying them out loud. That the name Mercer was not just a name, it was a sentence that ended arguments, a sentence that had made consequence for 27 years, something that happened to other people. On the evening of October 1st, at approximately 7:50 p.m., on the corner of Harlan Street and 5th Avenue, Brandon Mercer walked past a man named Walter Gaines. Before I tell you what happened in those 90 seconds, I want to tell you who Walter Gaines is. Because in cases like this, it matters. Not because some victims deserve more justice than others. Every person who walks through those gallery doors is entitled to equal protection under the law. But because the full weight of what was done to Walter Gaines cannot be understood without understanding the life that was treated in less than 2 minutes as an obstacle. Walter Gaines was 67 years old. He had served in the United States Army from 1977 to 1981. He spent the following 3 decades working as an electrician, building a small company from nothing, employing between 4 and 8 people depending on the season, raising 2 daughters. He retired at 62. Walter had been blind in his right eye since the age of 59, the result of a retinal condition caught too late to fully reverse. His left eye retained partial vision, not enough to see, on a fading October evening, a young man walking fast in the opposite direction until he was less than 4 feet away. Walter stepped slightly to his right to give way. Their shoulders made contact. Walter's cane caught on a seam in the pavement, and he stumbled, catching himself with one hand on a parking meter. He did not fall. He steadied himself. He turned toward the sound of footsteps and said, in the even voice of a man who has learned patience the long way, "Excuse me, I almost went down there." Brandon Mercer shoved Walter Gaines with both hands. He walked back to where Walter was standing. He squared his shoulders, and he shoved a 67-year-old, partially blind veteran with enough force that Walter's cane went one direction and Walter went the other, landing on the sidewalk at the base of the parking meter he had just been using to hold himself upright. Brandon stood over him. The camera captured his face for 4 full seconds. He was not alarmed. Then he put his hands in his jacket pockets and walked away. He did not look back, not once. Walter Gaines lay on that sidewalk for 6 minutes before a woman named Priya Okafor, who had been watching from inside the pharmacy entrance, came out and knelt beside him. He had a fractured wrist, 2 cracked ribs, a laceration at the back of his head that required 8 stitches. His cane was broken in 2 pieces. He had carried that cane for 4 years. Now I want you to stop right here and drop a comment. When you hear that detail, that the car was registered to the mayor's office, what do you expect to happen next? Do you expect an arrest? Do you expect a phone call that makes it go away quietly? Because what happened next is not what Brandon Mercer expected. Subscribe right now if you have not already, because we are not yet at the part of this story I have thought about every single week since the morning it happened. Brandon Mercer was arrested 48 hours after the incident. His attorney had him released within 4 hours. The charges, assault and battery, reckless endangerment of a person with a disability, were, in his attorney's words, a significant overreaction to what had been an incidental street contact. Walter Gaines spent 2 nights in the hospital. The case came to my courtroom on a Tuesday. He was wearing a charcoal suit that had not come off any rack. His attorney walked half a step behind him, carrying a portfolio thick enough to signal that everything would be argued, every document questioned, every procedure invoked, until the room ran out of time or patience. Brandon did not look at Walter Gaines. Walter was sitting in the front row of the gallery in his dress clothes, his wrist in a brace, his daughter Ruth beside him with her hand over his. Brandon looked at the exits, at his phone, which his attorney quietly removed, at the ceiling, everywhere except the front row. That told me everything I needed to know before a single word was spoken. I called the case. Brandon's attorney was immediately in motion. His client, he said, had been involved in unexpected physical contact on a crowded sidewalk. The contact had been mutual. The resulting fall was unfortunate, but not criminal. The family had already arranged for Mr. Gaines's medical expenses to be covered in full. I looked at Brandon. "Mr. Mercer, do you understand the charges before this court?" He held my gaze and said, "I understand that this has been significantly blown out of proportion." I asked the officer to present the evidence. What followed was the footage from the pharmacy camera on Harlan and Fifth. The angle was elevated, giving a clear overhead view of the full sidewalk. There was no ambiguity in what it showed. Walter stepping aside, the contact, Walter steadying himself, Walter speaking, Brandon stopping, Brandon turning around, Brandon walking back, the shove, Walter on the ground, the 4 seconds, the hands in the pockets, the walk away without a single backward glance. The courtroom watched every frame in complete silence. When the footage ended, I looked at Brandon Mercer. He shrugged. He actually shrugged, the way someone shrugs when you show them something they have already decided is not their problem. I said, "Mr. Mercer, walk me through your thinking on that sidewalk." He said, "He was in my way. There was contact. I reacted." I said, "The footage shows you walking back toward him after the initial contact. You covered 8 feet in the direction you had come from. That is not a reaction. A reaction is involuntary. What I watched on that screen was a decision." He said, "I wanted to make sure he understood not to grab people on the street." I said, "He was not grabbing you. He was reaching toward a sound he could not clearly see." Mr. Gaines has partial vision in one eye. He was orienting himself toward a collision he did not see coming. His jaw tightened slightly. That is not something I would have known. I said, "You are correct, which is exactly why the law requires you to stop and determine whether the person you have put on the ground is injured before you walk away." His attorney placed a hand on his arm. Brandon did not look at him, and then he said the sentence that changed the temperature of the room. He said, "Your Honor, my father has served this city for 14 years. He has given everything to this community. I think with some perspective, we can all agree there are better ways to resolve a situation like this one." I removed my glasses. Every attorney in that courtroom knew what that meant. I said, "Mr. Mercer, I am going to stop you there. Your father is not in this courtroom. You are. His 14 years of service belong to him. They are not transferable. They are not a resource you carry in your pocket to spend when your own decisions have consequences. And the fact that you just invoked another man's record as a reason I should use my time differently tells me more about the shape of your thinking than anything else you have said this morning." I looked at him steadily, and then the moment happened that I want you to stay for. The moment I have thought about nearly every week since that Tuesday morning, because it did not come from me. It came from the second row of the gallery, and it came quietly. The most important things in any courtroom always do. Mayor Richard Mercer stood up. He had been sitting there since the beginning. He had watched the footage. He had heard every word his son said. He had heard the shrug. He had heard his name used as a bargaining chip. He had sat through all of it in a gray suit with no expression I could fully read until he was on his feet and walking. Brandon turned around slowly. I watched his face move through several things in quick succession. Surprise, then relief. The relief of someone who has just spotted the resource he was counting on. Then something else entirely, arriving the moment he read his father's face and understood that what was walking toward him was not rescue. Mayor Mercer reached the front of the courtroom. He looked at his son for a moment without speaking. Brandon said nothing. I said, "Mayor Mercer, your son has indicated on multiple occasions this morning that your position will shape the outcome of these proceedings. I would like to give you the opportunity to address that directly." Mayor Richard Mercer stood straight. When he spoke, his voice was even. I could hear what holding it even was costing him. He said, "Your Honor, my son is wrong. He has always been wrong about that. And the fact that he is still wrong about it at 27 years old is something I have to accept as my failure as much as his." He paused. "I have held this office for 14 years. The one thing I have never done is ask for special treatment because of my name. Not for myself, not for anyone connected to me. I did not build what I built by asking rooms to tilt in my direction." He looked directly at Brandon. "I watched the footage this morning before I came here. I read the medical report. I know what my son did to Mr. Gaines on that corner, and I know what he did afterward. He put a 67-year-old veteran on the ground and walked away without finding out whether he got back up. That is not something 14 years of public service makes acceptable. That is not something a name erases." His voice held, but I could hear the seam in it. He said, "I am asking you to give Mr. Gaines the full weight of what this court provides, not a reduced version, the full weight, and I am asking you to be harder on my son than you might otherwise be, because he needs to understand that my position has never been his to use. I gave him the name and the access, and I did not make sure he understood what either of those things required of him. Today is the day he learns what they require." He stopped, and then he said the words I will carry with me until the last day I sit on this bench. He said, "I love my son. I want you to know that, because what I am asking you to do does not feel like love. But I have spent 14 years asking this city to trust me. The only way I can continue asking for that trust is if I hold the people closest to me to the same standard I hold everyone else. Today that starts here. Brandon was looking at the floor. His attorney was not speaking. There was nothing left to say. I have been on this bench for 38 years. I have seen fathers beg me to reduce charges. I have seen fathers who looked at what their children had done and walked out of the room. I have seen fathers who did not come at all, who sent attorneys with checks and every instrument available that was not their actual presence. I had never seen a father stand in open court, in front of cameras, in front of the man his son had put on the ground, and say, give him everything the law allows, and give him more, because he needs to understand that what I built was never a shield for him to hide behind. That man loved his son. You could hear it in the seam in his voice. But he loved something else more. He loved the 38 years Walter Gaines had spent building a life with his hands. He loved the Sunday phone calls and the evening routes and the idea that a 67-year-old man should be able to walk a familiar street without being put on the ground by someone who calculated he could walk away. That is what integrity actually costs. I looked at Walter Gaines, sitting quietly in the front row. Mr. Gaines, I said, would you like to address this court? He stood slowly. His ribs were still healing. He stood straight anyway. He said, I spent 4 years in the United States Army. I spent 30 years after that building something with my hands. I have 4 grandchildren. I call my daughter every Sunday. I walk my route every evening because my doctor told me to keep moving, and because after 30 years of work, standing still has never felt right to me. He paused. I have been walking that route for 4 years. I know every crack in that pavement. I know which lights flicker. I know the smell of the bakery on the corner before I reach it. On the evening of October 1st, I was walking my route, and a young man knocked me down and walked away without finding out whether I got up. He looked toward Brandon, not with anger, with something older and steadier than anger. He said, I am not here for an apology. A man who has to be ordered by a court to say he is sorry is not actually sorry. I am here because I have 4 grandchildren, and I want them to grow up in a world where what was done to me on that corner has a name, where it is called assault, where it stays assault, regardless of whose car was parked outside, where a name, no matter whose name it is, does not change what the law requires. That is the only reason I am standing here. He sat back down. Ruth put her hand over his. Brandon Mercer was looking at the table. The certainty he had carried through my door that morning was gone. What was in its place was something earlier than remorse. The first real understanding that the floor he had been standing on his entire life was not made of what he thought. I looked at him for a long time before I spoke. Brandon Mercer, I find you guilty of assault and battery and reckless endangerment of a person with a disability, which carries an enhanced penalty under the law of this state. Your actions on October 1st were not incidental contact. They were a decision. You made the decision to walk back. You made the decision to use both hands. You made the decision to stand over a 67-year-old man for 4 seconds and determine that he was not worth your attention. And you made the decision to keep walking. Here is what this court orders. You will pay full restitution to Walter Gaines, full medical expenses, full replacement of his mobility aid, and 12 months of documented compensation for the disruption to his daily independence, because a man whose evening walk is the structure of his day has had that structure broken, and that cost does not appear on any invoice, but it is real. You will complete 240 hours of community service at the Harlan Street Veterans Assistance Center, 6 blocks from the corner where this happened. You will not answer phones. You will not sit at a desk. You will assist veterans with mobility impairments with transportation, navigation, and whatever physical support they require. You will learn every name in that building. You will learn every branch of service, every year served, every story offered to you. You will stay when it is inconvenient to stay. You will arrive before you are expected. You will complete a court-certified disability awareness and accountability program with written reflections submitted to this court. And you will write a letter to Walter Gaines, not a legal document, a letter in your own words in which you explain to him, not to your attorney, not to your father, not to me, what you understand now that you did not understand on October 1st. That letter will be reviewed by this court before it is delivered. I picked up my gavel. You walked away from that corner without looking back. You have spent 27 years learning that walking away was something you were allowed to do. This court is giving you 240 hours to learn something different. I looked at him one final time. Mr. Mercer, your father just stood in this courtroom and told you that his name was never yours to spend. Look at him. That is what it looks like to carry something honestly. That is what a name is supposed to stand for. Start working on becoming that. The gavel came down. As the bailiff moved to process the paperwork, Mayor Richard Mercer crossed the courtroom to where Walter Gaines was sitting. He extended his hand. Walter looked at it for a moment, the kind of moment that has weight, and then he shook it. The mayor said something I could not fully hear from the bench, but I saw Walter nod slowly, and I saw the beginning of something in that exchange that I will not name because I do not know what it became. I only know what it looked like from where I was sitting. It looked like one man telling another that what happened was real, and that real things require real responses. Brandon watched his father from across the room. He was 27 years old, and the scaffolding had come down. The name, the connections, the assumption that consequence applied to other people, all of it was gone. What was left was a man who did not yet know who he was without it. That is a hard thing to be. I am not going to pretend otherwise, but I believe that the moment the floor gives way is also the moment something real becomes possible. 8 months later, I received a letter from Ruth Gaines. She wrote that her father had received Brandon Mercer's letter. 4 drafts over 3 weeks. The final version was 3 pages long. She had read it aloud to her father twice at his request, slowing down on certain paragraphs when he asked her to. She wrote that Brandon had completed 170 hours at the Veterans Assistance Center. The director there, a man named Clarence Webb, who had run the center for 17 years and did not offer praise easily, had submitted a report to this court. Clarence wrote that Brandon arrived the first morning with the posture of someone doing penance, stood near the door, answered questions in as few words as possible, did the minimum of what was asked. He wrote that by the 4th week, something had changed. Brandon was arriving early. He had learned every name, every branch, every year of service. He had started staying late on Thursdays to sit with veterans whose family visits had become infrequent, not talking much, just being present in the way that presence matters when someone's world has gotten very quiet. Clarence wrote, I cannot tell you what happened to this young man in a courtroom. I can only tell you what I see here. What I see is someone who came in believing he was doing time and has started to understand he is doing something else. Ruth wrote at the end of her letter, my father went back to his route last week, the full route, Harlan to 5th and back, the same 47 minutes he has been walking for 4 years. He called me afterward. He said the pavement felt the same under his feet. He said he could smell the bakery before he reached it, the same as always. He said that was the point of going back, to find out if it still did. I have thought about that sentence every week since I read it. Not because it is dramatic, because it is true in a way that dramatic moments rarely are. The sentence that matters is never the one delivered from the bench. It is the one written 8 months later by a daughter who learned that her father went back to his route and the bakery still smelled the same. That is what justice looked like on October 3rd. Not the footage, not the sentence, not the moment Brandon's certainty gave way. The lesson is that the most powerful thing in any courtroom is not the gavel, it is character. It is the choice each person makes about who they want to be in the moment that actually tests them. Walter Gaines had that character. He stood with a broken wrist and healing ribs and told a room full of strangers that he was not there for an apology. He was there for his grandchildren. Mayor Richard Mercer had that character. He walked down that center aisle knowing exactly what it would cost him, and he did it anyway. And Brandon Mercer, I believe, is beginning to learn it. Later than he should have, through a harder door than most, but Clarence says he is learning it. Ruth says her father received a real letter, and Walter went back to his root, and the bakery still smelled the same. In my experience, that is enough. In my experience, that is everything. If you believe that no one is above the law, not the wealthy, not the connected, not the children of people who have spent their careers in public service, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel, because these are the stories that need to be told and heard and shared with the people in your lives who still believe accountability is possible. And leave me a comment right now. Tell me, what would you have done if you had been sitting in that gallery when Mayor Mercer walked down that aisle? What would you have done if Brandon had been your son? I want to know, because justice is not only what happens in a courtroom. It is the choice each of us makes when someone we love does something wrong, when we have the chance to let a name do the work or to walk down an aisle and refuse. Choose wisely every single time. Choose wisely.